you. So, oh, there we go. Technical difficulties?
Oh no, I just didn't turn it on until now.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. We are a small group, but that gives you more opportunities to ask the speaker searching questions and so on. I don't think it has anything to do with the quality of work you're going to hear about. It's just that online learning is not a very well-known strategy on campus, and not as many people as should be interested in it are interested. But we are here and we are interested, and we have an excellent presenter. He is currently an assistant professor in our College of Education, where he teaches instructional technology and qualitative research methodology. He is one of the bright young faculty who the state has been hiring recently to sustain and enhance its academic and research standing as a top-ranked university, and of course to bring us into the 21st century, because online education is the wave of the future. He claims to us very well prepared to teach in his specialties and to be an academic role model for his students. He holds a PhD in instructional technology from the Department of Educational Psychology and Instructional Technology at the University of Georgia. His dissertation there focused on understanding rural secondary student learning habits when engaged in scheduled synchronous and asynchronous online learning through a province-wide supplemental K-12 distance education program. Pretty long topic. Prior to his doctoral studies, he completed his Master's of Education with a concentration in literacy and computers in education, and his Bachelor's of Education from Memorial University of Newfoundland. Prior to his studies in education, Michael completed his Bachelor of Arts with a major in political science and a minor in history from Carleton University. And these are top-ranked universities in Canada. You hear about Carleton and you hear about Memorial University. And of course, he recently completed a certificate in adult education from St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia. His research interest is in distant education, and that began after he accepted his first teaching position in a rural high school. Having been educated in an urban area, Michael was troubled by the inequity of opportunity provided to his rural students, and began a program to offer advanced placement social studies courses online at his own school and in other schools in the district. For more than a decade now, Michael has worked with numerous K-12 online learning programs in Canada, United States, New Zealand, and around the world as a teacher, course developer, administrator, evaluator, and researcher. So you see, he's not only learned, but he has applied his learning socially and compassionately. His current research interests focus on the effective design, delivery, and support of online learning to K-12 students in virtual school environments, particularly those in rural jurisdictions. So, Michael has been a very strong supporter of the Humanities Center. This is his third Brambach talk, and in this case, he valiantly stepped in to fill a breach created by a professor who had suddenly discovered a conflict in her program. So we did not get to advertise this program as well as we could have. But Michael is here still. He was also a resident scholar in our facility last year and was a very engaging member of that group. So I am absolutely delighted and also very grateful to welcome to the podium Professor Michael K. Barbour, who will speak to us on opposing the dominant K-12 online learning narrative of educational reformers. Please welcome him with applause.
Thank you. I'm never quite sure how long to make those bios when you ask for them. I've actually got 4 different versions, and I always sort of pick one that I think will kind of suit the situation. As Dr. Edwards mentioned, I'm Mike Barbour. I'm over in the College of Ed. Actually, I can see my office right about there, 3rd floor. This side, so it's kind of nice. I get to look at the administration every now and then. I've been involved with K-12 online learning and K-12 distance ed for over a decade now, and what is starting to happen, and really has been happening for about the last 4 or 5 years within the American context, and it really only is within the American context, it has actually become quite troubling to me. And it's one of the reasons why I give this kind of talk, actually on a fairly frequent basis. I gave a 12-minute version of this to the Texas Senate Education Committee only on Monday, because they're looking at revising their virtual learning standards down there. So essentially, if you look at what we've seen really over the last 4 to 5 years in the United States, we've really been bombarded with a lot of information about the nature of what online learning can do, particularly for our high school students, but also to a lesser extent throughout the K-12 environment. We've had Horn and Christensen's Disrupting Class, where they talk about how online learning will eventually become the majority of the way in which we deliver K-12 education in this country, and they even predict that will happen within a decade of their publication, so that would be 2019 for those of you keeping score. Mo and Chubb, who are 2 political scientists, I should note that none of these folks, for the most part, are educators. Christensen and Horn and those guys are all business professors. Mo and Chubbs are poli-sci guys, not that I have a problem with them. That was what my first degree was in, but what I knew about effective instruction and effective pedagogy when I was a political scientist was quite limited, and reading through their book, it shows that it is quite limited to these guys as well. But basically, Liberating Learning is a book about how online learning companies are going to bust unions and all those other folks that have a stranglehold on the education system. Saving Schools from Horseman to Virtual Learning, Peterson, another poli-sci guy. You've got, the NSF has got their, they call it networked learning. INACO, or the International Association for K-12 Online Learning, one of the major players in the American Educational Legislative Council, and we all know their particular ideological leanings. And then we've got, even the U.S. Department of Education, unfortunately, has gotten into the act, but let's face it, they haven't really been all that neutral in the past 12 to 15 years on this topic either. When you look at what that actual dominant narrative says, basically there are really kind of 4 points that they underscore. The fact that students today, because they've grown up with a digital environment, they've had digital tools all around them, are digital learners. No ands, ifs, buts about it. Second, that digital content, digital instruction is high quality. Not, a matter of what it can be high quality, but it is. When you look at, the way in which they present this narrative, it is high quality. And that because it's high quality, both the content and the instruction, that all students should have access to it. And one only needs to look at the 10 principles of the Digital Learning Now initiative. This is the former governors Bush and Wise program that have been going around the country trying to convince people to engage the Digital Learning Initiative. And all you've got to do is look at some of the key words there. Today's learners are digital learners. Content is high quality. High quality providers. It goes on here, as you can see, the nature of what they're focusing upon. And this is what our legislators are hearing. When Michigan was looking at the changes to their cyberschooling legislation back last, I guess it was December and January, Bob Wise comes to town, and this is the song and dance that he's singing. The companies that are providing this come to town, and this is the song and dance that they're providing. And when you start to look at these individual ones, and we'll look at each of these sort of 4 narratives, closely, they really don't hold that much water. So first one was that all of our students today are digital learners. And this comes out of a series of research, and you can see some of the main players and books in here. But, when we think about today's learner, this is the young lady that we get. This is actually an ad from Adobe that came out actually probably in 2004, 2005, around that point in time. You know, if you look at this young lady, I mean, first you want to look at the caption, ready or not, here they come, and basically it goes on to say, you know, that today's learner are digital learners and we need to prepare them, and so because of that you've got to buy Adobe products. You know, but if you look at this young lady, I mean, you know, she is really decked out here. You know, she's got her laptop there, which, let's face it, today would only be about half that size because it would be a netbook, not a big old laptop. You know, she's got her cell phone there, she's got her MP3 there, she's got her digital PDA there. Today, that would be all three in one device. You know, I mean, she's got her big old earphones here. She's got her webcam thing hanging around her neck. I mean, hell, she's even got a watch that looks like it could land the space shuttle with. I mean, you know, this girl is decked out when it comes to technology, and ready or not, she is coming to a classroom near you. You know, that is the premise that you're given. It's a premise that within the literature actually is based upon a theory of generational differences. You know, this notion that essentially roughly every 20 years, the people born in that kind of time period, you know, have a similar set of characteristics. You know, they share a similar cultural understanding, similar historical events, and, you know, people that are sort of born right at the, actually they call them cuspers, right at the cusp of one generation or another, may exhibit characteristics of the other generation. So if you look at the past century that we've just gone through, you know, here's the 5 generations that have been identified. You know, I'll say that I came near the end of Generation X. I'm actually close to being a cusper, which means that I should exhibit some characteristics of today's student and some characteristics of the Gen X folks. You know, but this is what we're, and in all honesty, there's been a fair amount of agreement as to the first 4 generations in terms of what we call them, the characteristics in which they possess, the types of things that have influenced them. It's that 5th category, and I've just nebulized it and called it today's student. We'll go into some of the labels here in a second here now. The first of which is actually this notion that they're the net generation. This actually comes from a guy by the name of Don Tapscott, who's written a couple of books now. This is the first one, Growing Up Digital, which I think came out in about 2003, 2004. He's since published a new one called Grown Up Digital, which came out about 5 years later. Now, Don's work is interesting because basically it's the same kind of narrative. You know, digital technology has been pervasive in our kids' youth. Because of that they learn differently, they think differently, they interact with each other differently. His line that he actually used was, you know, within each generation there is a generational gap that will exist. You know, from the baby boomers to the Gen Xers. There's a reason why, you know, my high school teacher, when he'd bring in the VCR to, you know, show a video in my history class, could never actually get that flashing 12 on the VCR to actually go away, whereas every student in the room knew how to do it. You know, there's always that gap. But he says that with this particular generation, it's no longer a generational gap when it comes to technology, that this generation has lapped the previous generation. The problem is that Don's work is based upon survey research. Not that survey research is necessarily bad, because he actually does have a decent sample. There are, you know, I think about 16,000, 17,000 people that filled out his initial survey. The problem is that he circulated it on places like MySpace and Facebook and Twitter and other social media sites. You know, if I'm standing around Comerica Park this afternoon asking people, you know, who's going to win the baseball game tonight, doesn't matter how many people I ask, I'm going to get a very specific answer. Right? It's not necessarily an accurate answer. You know, if you ask a skewed population, you're going to get a skewed response. And that's exactly what Don has done here. It's essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you ask a bunch of people that use technology in intimate ways, and very innovative technology at that, of course they're going to say technology has a drastic impact upon the way in which they live. You know, for people who don't know what the Twitter is, they're going to have a very different story. Another one that you hear a fair amount about, although in terms of the media, these guys really haven't got as much play in the last 5 years. It was really right about the time the millennium was changing that you heard a lot about these folks. Howe and Strauss, Neil Howe and I think it's Bill Strauss, wrote a book called Millennials Rising, in which they essentially said that today's youth were optimistic, upbeat, they were engaged, they tended to be more liberal than any other previous generation. I actually should have, instead of actually criticizing it there, I should have put all the descriptors there, going back and forth with these. The problem is, again, similar to Tapscott's work, it's based upon survey research and not the big sample that Tapscott had. He's got about, I think it's 1,100 folks that he sampled. Actually, they're high school students in Fairfax, Virginia. High schools in Fairfax, Virginia. How many people here are familiar with where exactly Fairfax, Virginia is? You know, Crystal City, the entire U.S. Defense and Intelligence community is located there. One of the most affluent places in the entire United States. I think right now it's the 3rd highest zip code in terms of socioeconomic status. The largest ethnic minority in the entire zip code are actually Asians. The average, I think, school has, it's 11% free and reduced lunch, whereas in the rest of the D.C. area, it's something like 50 or 60%. You know, so yeah, if I go into one of the richest neighborhoods in the country, you know, where the average family has two parents working, both of whom have master's degrees, I'm going to feel pretty engaged and pretty upbeat, and I'm probably going to come from a pretty liberal background, you know, and I'm probably going to feel pretty good about life. You know, if I go to the other side of the tracks in D.C., or for that matter, talk to anyone here in downtown Detroit, I'm going to get a very different response when I start talking to 16-year-olds about, you know, well, tell me about you and your generation. My favorite one, Mark Prensky. Mark comes up with this notion of digital natives. It actually came out of an article that he wrote in an online journal called From Now On. Mark is probably best known because he has written a couple of books on game-based learning, and essentially how we need to change all education, high school, elementary, university, into these game-style environments, because that's how kids learn today. The notion of digital natives is that in the same way that if you think of an immigrant to a particular country compared to someone who was born in a country, if you look at technology in that respect, someone who was born into a world where digital technology is pervasive, you know, essentially understands it. It's the only thing they've ever known. Whereas an immigrant coming to that kind of environment, while they may gain some of the skills and some facility with the language and the culture and how to navigate that kind of world, they will always maintain their accent, as he calls it. You know, that Achilles heel in terms of their ability to operate the technology. Now, Mark's is my favorite because at least the other guys did surveys. Flawed surveys, but surveys nonetheless. Mark, who's not an academic, he's basically a guy who gets paid, you know, thousands of dollars to go speak and then writes books. Mark, in his upper middle class family, decides to sit around and, you know, he's watching his kids interact, he's watching his nieces and nephews and their friends from around the neighborhood in his upper middle class environment interact, and comes up with this idea, you know, these guys are all using technology and they're using it much better than I ever could, and, you know, comes up with this notion, basically. I mean, if research was just this easy, where I could sit around and watch my youngsters and my nieces and nephews, you know, I mean, man, oh man, would I have it made. And then get paid thousands of dollars to go and speak on that, you know, non-existent research. Another thing that we typically hear about this particular generation is this notion that they are master multitaskers. And again, while not that they come up with this notion because of technology. They say, you know, they're so used to doing, you know, 6 or 7 different devices going at the same time. You know, you open up their computer and there's a half a dozen windows going, you know, and so they've become good at this. And in all honesty, this is something that we've known for a long time that isn't necessarily the case. Essentially what's happening here, and this is just one study, literally there are hundreds of them that I could have put up there. But this is one where essentially they are testing how much students remember when they are distracted and when they're not distracted. So this solid line here is how much they remember, essentially words per minute. So here's your cumulative number of words recalled here. Here's the number of seconds that they took them to recall them. Solid line is if they weren't distracted at all. So, you know, they had the full attention both when they were remembering the things and when they were recalling the things. This second line here is essentially when they were distracted at retrieval. So this is when they were distracted when they were trying to tell you what it was that they just had to memorize. The bottom line here is how much they remembered when they were distracted while they were trying to remember the stuff. You know, so essentially if your child is doing their homework and doing something else at the same time, they're not learning as much. Actually, by this, they're learning about half the amount they'd be learning if they just paid attention to what it was they were doing. And this is not new for us. I mean, anyone who understands the psychology of learning knows that the way in which we learn things is we task switch. There's no such thing as multiple tasks. Essentially, we spend so much time looking at this and so much time looking at this, and if we've got 6 windows open on our computer, it's not that we remember everything that's going on in all 6 at the same time. Our mind is going back and forth from one thing to the other, and there's that little period of recall that has to happen to figure out, okay, now where was I here? You know, for those of you that have children, when you ask them, you know, you weren't listening to me, and then it takes them a couple of seconds, but they can recite exactly what you had just said to them, and it annoys the hell out of you that they can do that. You know, it's not because they were paying attention. It's simply because that little bit of time that they had was the amount of time they had to take to access that. They weren't paying attention in the first place. This was just all extra information that was coming in. And if you never asked them what I just said, they would never be able to retrieve that because they weren't forced to go and encode it at that moment. So what do we actually know about this generation? If they're not digital learners, what can we tell you about them? Well, the one thing that we can tell you about them, at least based on the research, is that this is the most narcissistic generation that we have ever encountered. This actually comes from the work by Jean Twenge, who's out at one of the University of California campuses. Wonderful book. If you haven't read Generation Me, I would highly recommend it. If you're interested in sort of generational differences. Essentially, what Jean has done is she's been using the Narcissism Survey Index, which was an instrument that was developed within this lab that she's at. And they've been basically using it consistently since the late 50s, early 60s with college freshmen and college seniors. You know, so they've got a sample from the 60s, samples from the 70s, samples from the 80s, the 90s, and even the noughts. And, you know, so we've got this big window of data from all 50 states, you know, hundreds of thousands. I think they're actually up over 1 million entries in this data system now. And what do they find? Well, it's quite interesting because you would think that, well, you know, if kids are more narcissistic today than ever before, maybe it's been a gradual thing. No, it hasn't been. Throughout the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, right up until the mid-90s, the Narcissism Index tended to be in that 18 to 31% range. You know, right about a little bit less than, you know, a quarter to a third. In the mid-90s, right about the time that those cuspers, people like myself, were hitting the university environment, it jumps, and jumps dramatically, to like 68 to 83%. You know, it increases between 3 and 4 times the amount. You know, so it's not this little gradual rise. It's like going along all nice and steady. People are about the same as they've been for decades and decades, and then all of a sudden it goes like this. You know, and it's a fascinating book when you go through it. And she's actually got an article that came out in 2005 that was published in, of all places, a journal called Medical Education. It's the one time where she actually specifically focused upon what this generational me stuff means for learning. I don't know why she focused upon a med school environment to give us that message as opposed to, say, an education journal, but I guess medical education would be an education journal for med school folks. You know, but the book itself only has one chapter that looks at education, and it's a very not formal education, sort of more informal education, you know, how students learn and what this means, as opposed to what does it mean for a classroom teacher or for a university faculty member. You know, but it's fascinating to look through. So, I mean, basically, the one thing we can say is they're not digital learners. In fact, most of the research that's been done on their digital savviness, their technical savviness, has basically shown that, you know, to use a colloquial phrase, you know, that it's a mile wide and, mile wide and an inch thick. You know, they have a cursory understanding of a lot of stuff, but when you require them to actually do much with it, they simply can't. And not only can they not do it, they really don't have a good understanding of how to go about finding out how to do it. You know, if you've ever watched any of our undergrads over there in the library search for things on Google, you'll get a sense as to how poor they are in terms of trying to figure out what it is they actually need to be able to do. You know? So let's look at this next one, this notion that, you know, both the instruction and the content that gets provided is high quality. And if you notice, 4 of the 10 things in the Digital Learning Now thing all focused upon this notion that online learning is by virtue high quality. Well, you should surmise that, well, if it's high quality, then students should do well in those environments, right? I mean, it makes sense. If you're providing high quality instruction and it's, you know, high quality delivery, students should be doing well. So the first thing you want to do then is look at how the students are performing. And I'll go through some of these quickly because you're going to notice a theme here. Study done up in Alberta, Canada, found that students in the online and face-to-face environment were similar in English and social studies, but the face-to-face students did better in all the other areas. Florida Virtual School, half the students got A's, whereas only 7% received failing grades. Kathy Kavanaugh's meta-analysis found a small positive effect for the online students. Another Canadian study in 3 provinces, 6 virtual schools, comparing them to, I think it was 9 face-to-face classes, found, and I love the way they worded this, that the online students did no worse than the face-to-face students. I always found that a curious way of wording. I've never met these 2 authors, but I'd love to ask them why they chose that wording. The Illinois Virtual High School, in its first year, had a 53% completion rate, followed by an 80% the following year, which, you know, for high school, not bad. Kathy's 2004 meta-analysis said there were small negative effect size. A couple of studies done with the Florida Virtual School that were funded through the North Regional Educational Laboratory. In Kathy's first one, she found that the online students did better. In McLeod and his team, their study found that, again, the online students did better. If you look, again, going north of the border into Canada, completion rate for the Alberta Distance Learning Centre was about half, but if you added in synchronous instruction, it jumped to 9 out of every 10 students. The Centre for Distance Learning in Newfoundland, students in the online classes doing as well as the face-to-face one.
What's asynchronous?
Asynchronous means not real time.
Okay.
So essentially you put an online course there, students go through at their own pace, so there's no real live sessions that are going on, whereas synchronous would be the live sessions that happen. So it's kind of like the difference between, say, Blackboard and Wimba. Wimba being synchronous, Blackboard being asynchronous, or at least the way we use them here at Wayne. You know, but the thing is, you've got to look deeper, because if you notice there, for the most part, with the exception of a couple of little blips, the message was that the online students do as well or better than. You know, so when you start to look a little bit deeper, and I've just picked these 2 because they're 2 of the more recent ones. It's interesting because if I picked the initial Florida virtual one, the Big B McCarroll from 2000, what they don't tell you is while 50% of the students got an A and only 7% received a failing grade, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/2 of those students dropped out before the final assessment. You know, so when you factor those in, if half the students dropped, half of the remaining students got an A, so 25% got an A. You know, 7% of the remaining, which if you look at it would be about 3.5% of the overall group, received a failing grade. But if you count all the ones that dropped out as being potential failures, that means, well, there was now 53.5% that essentially failed, or failed to complete anyway. These 2 more recent ones, I think, speak to probably a more underlying problem. If you look at Kathy's study, she was the one that found that the students, online students did better than. One of the things she speculated was that the online cohort were naturally more high achieving and naturally more motivated. McLeod and his team basically figured that most of the students who were in the course by the end of the semester were the better students. The students that were going to do poorly in the course had already dropped out of the course by the time they gave their assessment. So of course, you know, if all of your weaker students have already dropped out, you expect the online students to do better. At least I would. You know, and when you look at the online students that we have, this shouldn't surprise you. You know, if you look at how we've described the typical online student, you know, again, I'll go through these a little quick because you're going to see a common theme here. Most of them planning to attend a 4-year college. Honor students, college bound. Love Margaret and Bill's quote. These are some of the, you know, you get those lines in a journal article that, you know, perfect turns of phrases that you wish you had written first. Well, this is one of those that I wish, you know, I could claim to. Highly motivated, self-directed, self-disciplined, independent learner who could read and write well, also had a strong interest in or ability with technology. Sounds like your typical DPS student, doesn't it? Right? Or average K-12 student in general. Let's see, participation rates only needs high need to control and structure their own learning. Highly motivated, high achieving, self-directed, like to work independently, typical an A or B student. I've already done that. Half of them were advanced place or academically advanced, or advanced placement, sorry, or academically advanced. You know, so when you look at the online literature, the type of student that we have tended to get in the online environment, at least at the K-12 level, is like this young lady. The problem is that there's a good deal of students, many of them in her own backyard, that resemble this young lady more. And the question you have to start asking yourself is, well, what happens when this kind of student starts to enter into that online environment where, typically speaking, you've only had the best and the brightest? and even the best and the brightest. Because the other thing you got to remember here now, remember those studies that we were looking at that had the performance? They did as well, or typically a little bit better. There was no one that said they did dramatically better. So as well or a little bit better. So if you've got your best and brightest, and you're comparing them to everybody else, and they're only doing as well as everybody else, or a little bit better than everyone else, you got to ask yourself, you know, what kind of crappy online learning are these kids going through that we're dumbing them down to the average? You know, these kids, of all people. What happens when these guys get in? Well, it's quite interesting when you see these folks start to enter in. Again, I'm going to go through a bunch there. Most of these ones, and this is the unfortunate thing about online learning, the vast majority of actual research done by researchers has focused upon the supplemental students. There's very little empirical research that's focused upon the full-time students, and those weaker students tend to end up in the full-time programs. So these are the ones that are being offered, like the Michigan Connections Academy, or Michigan Virtual, or Westwood Cyber, or the St. Clair Virtual Learning Academy, where the kids don't go to a brick-and-mortar school. They basically learn from a computer and from a teacher that sat in Okemos, or that sat over in Grand Rapids, that they may or may not ever see in their entire career. When you look at the work that's been done on these, unfortunately, well, I shouldn't say unfortunately, because I suppose if they weren't doing it, none of this work would be done. For the most part, it comes from either legislative audits that have been done by states that have actually wanted to know what's happening, or in many instances, investigative journalists that, you know, are looking at this and saying, you know, there's something more here, a story that's not being told. Very little of this, and I'll point at the couple that are actually based upon empirical studies. Interestingly enough, the first one is actually a RAND education study that they were doing. But you'll see a common theme here in these full-time programs when you start to expand the nature of students that you've got here. You know, they found that the online students had poor test results compared to the face-to-face students. And these were all charter students that they were looking at. In Colorado, a legislative audit that they had found that the students in math, reading, and writing, which were the 3 subjects that were tested by the statewide exam, were all performing lower than their face-to-face counterparts, and had been for a consistent period of time, 3 years at that stage. Again, if you look at Ohio, and again, there's another legislative audit, they found that the online charter schools that they've got all had negative, and in most cases substantially negative, statistically significant lower performance levels. In Wisconsin, another legislative audit, they found that in almost all areas, the online students were lower than the face-to-face students, or lower than the statewide averages for the school years, the 2 school years that they were looking at. In one of the few actual research studies, this was done by Gary Murin at Western Michigan under the auspices of the National Education Policy Center, found that if you look at the AYP ratings of brick-and-mortar public schools, brick-and-mortar charter schools, online charter schools, and actually, that was it, online charter schools. But then he also broke them down as to, with the charters, whether or not they were run by EMOs or nonprofits. And you know, what he found was that the online schools that were run by EMOs, like K-12 Inc. and Connections Academy, which are the 2 that are operating here in Michigan, their ability to meet AYP was substantially weaker to their brick-and-mortar counterparts. As you can see there, I mean, basically it's roughly half, 27% to 52%. Again, and this also comes from that same national study in 2001 by Murin, found, oh, sorry, no, missing something. That's actually from Arizona, sorry, Arizona 2011. Investigative journalists, iNews Network were actually the organization they worked for, found that when you looked at the online schools, particularly the larger ones, tended to lag behind in all areas of statewide testing compared to their face-to-face counterparts. A legislative audit in Colorado found that they were between 14 and 26% lower on the online state assessments than the state averages. Again, in Ohio, this was one done by a nonprofit group there. They looked at all 23 online schools and found that of the 23, actually only 3 of them rated as effective or better, which were the 2 classifications, effective and then whatever comes after effective, were the 2 classifications that they gave for passing schools. So essentially 20 out of the 23 full-time online programs in Ohio would be considered what we would consider here in Michigan failing schools based upon their AYP measures. Again, a legislative audit in Minnesota, found students in full-time online programs had significantly lower proficiency rates on the statewide exams. It's from that same state where that same audit in Minnesota. I don't know why I want to say Minneapolis there, but Minnesota. Full-time online students, and particularly in those lower grades, that 4 to 8, about half as much progress in math. You know, and if you've listened to any of the K-12 Inc. ads that are running, actually they're not running now because the deadline to enroll and get state funding has passed, but if you're listening to them before count day, and you heard any of the ads that you heard that K-12 were running, one of the things they talked about was, you know, if your kid is failing in the traditional environment, we're going to help them in this new environment because we're so good. You know, as you can see, not really. These last two actually come from another piece that Gary Murin did this past year, another National Education Policy Center report, where he actually looked specifically at K-12 Inc. and how they were doing, looking at both their funding models, student performance, pretty much any sort of metrics that he could get from either the company or from the states that they're involved in. Found that for the most part that the ones that they operated tended to be about the same as what he had found the previous year for all online charters, so that K-12 Inc. Tended to be no better than, and actually in many instances worse than, the average online charter school. Also found that for the most part, you know, that their ability to meet AYP was about the same as all of the rest online charters.
EMO?
Educational Management Organization.
I know it was a management.
Yeah, it's, for those not in the education field, essentially EMOs are education's version of the health insurance company. You know, and in that neoliberal model of education, where essentially they've privatized it, it pretty much maintains the same role. So the health insurance company says, you know, you don't get your chopped off finger sewn back on. The EMO really dictates pretty much, you know, the type of school that is going to be offered in the environment, if it's any good or not. And as you can see here, it's not that good. Interestingly, the only study outside of the internal ones that they do, and I should say that this one was actually partially funded by K-12 Inc., but the only study that's actually found that digital learning is high quality is this one that's been done at the University of Arkansas, looking at the Arkansas Virtual School, or Virtual Academy, sorry. And it's interesting to note a couple of things about it. You really have to dig into the report, because the report itself is only about an 11-page thing, and you can tell that it was essentially, while it was done by 2 academics, it was heavily edited by the marketing department of K-12 Inc. And it's very clear to see that, because pretty much any of the details that we would look for as researchers, particularly, you know, to get some of the statistical understandings of what's happening here, have all been removed. And they've been glossed over with, you know, some nice couchy statements that media types would pick up and see as, you know, okay, yeah, this is a very valid study. When you read carefully, a couple of the things that you'll note is that the online sample has all of its lowest performing students removed. Essentially, the way they did their sampling was the student was in the program for 2 years and essentially had to be there for, I think it's 4 different periods of testing. Any student who wasn't there for all 4 periods of testing gets removed. You know, one of the things that we know about online schools is, A, they have a very transient environment. You know, they have a very high dropout rate, as we've seen in a couple of these. So a lot of those weaker students drop out. Now, if you're a 14-year-old and you drop out of an online school, what happens to you? Well, you show back up in the face-to-face environment that, you know, you just left. You know, so by not including those folks, you know, you get a double whammy there, because in all that previous research we looked at, you get that double whammy. Because if students are dropping, if the weaker students drop out of the online environment, then they get added to that face-to-face environment. So you get a greater percentage of weaker students in there, and only the higher percentage of students that get left in the online environment. Interestingly, the online sample was a more affluent group, and we all know how socioeconomic status affects academic performance. The other thing is that they also had significantly fewer minority students in the online sample. And again, one of the things that actually, in all honesty, ties mostly to both those points, both those last 2 points tie to socioeconomic status. When you actually looked at the study itself, it's very interesting, because they talk throughout the study about how the online students did better. And in many instances, they did do better. When you actually start to take it apart, most of the differences weren't statistically significant. You know, so here's a sampling of them. When they're looking, for example, at the mathematics, you find that, you know, the lowest group, the grades 3 to 5, the online students, the face-to-face students were 1% more. In the 4 to 6 grades, the online students were 5% more. In the 5 to 7, the online students were 2% more. In the 6 to 8, the online students were 16% more. But the first 3 of those results weren't statistically significant. But you really had to go digging to find out that. They basically just gave you the raw percentages and said, well, on 3 of the 4 math measures, the online students did better, which, is accurate, but they didn't do statistically better. The only one they did statistically better on was that last one. Interestingly, for some reason, the researchers decided to use an alpha of 0.1. Now, how many statisticians do I have in a row? Any?
No, yeah, I just
Okay. Essentially, the average alpha that you would use when you're doing hypothesis testing, when you're comparing one mean to another, is 0.05. And we've seen that quite common. It's the standard measure, and it's not only the standard measure by researchers, it's the standard measure in all honesty in society. If you hear of any poll that's going on, we're in political season now, they always say that it's correct 19 times out of 20, plus or minus 2.5%. Right? Or they usually say 3%. That's essentially a 95% confidence level. A 0.05 alpha is a 95% confidence level. That's the standard measure. Now, if you're into something that A is either high stakes, or B is something that, is a relatively new field where you want to be a little bit more careful, a lot of times you'll use a 0.01 so that you have a 99% confidence. These guys are using a 0.1, which is an acceptable confidence level. Those are the 3 that are acceptable. 0.01, 0.05, and then 0.1 are the 3 ones that you would typically see. But you typically see the 0.1 when you're in an area where there's a great deal of variability, where there's a great deal of uncertainty, and really where the stakes don't matter all that much. So if you're off by 5 or 10%, that's okay, because essentially 0.1 is you're willing to accept the fact that there's a 10% chance that what you're doing is based on sheer luck or sheer chance. When you're looking at the education of a group of children, to me that's kind of high stakes. That's not something that I really want a 1 in 10 chance that you're going to be wrong at. But for whatever reason, that's the particular measure that these guys used. There's no explanation as to why. They don't actually give you the actual statistic in there so you could look to see, would this be significant at the 0.5 level? They just tell you that they used an alpha of 0.1 and leave it at that, and that it was statistically significant there. Similarly, if you look at the literacy ones, and I won't spend as much time on these, but you get the same thing. Again, at the lower levels, the face-to-face guys did better. All the other levels, the online guys did better. The only one that was statistically significant in this case was the 4 to 6 range. But again, it was at that 0.1 level, so we really don't know. There's a 10% chance there that that was just pure luck. And when you look at the difference in the sample that I started off by telling you, the sample was already skewed anyway. So in all honesty, I'd expect these online students to be doing a lot better. When we look at these performance issues and the notion of quality, one of the things that always comes back, and this is another book that if it's not on your bookshelf and if you are an educator in any broadest sense of the word, it's a book I'd highly recommend. Either Visible Learning or his more recent one, which is, I think, Teaching Visible Learning. John Hattie, H-A-T-T-I-E, I know it doesn't quite come out right there, H-A-T-T-I-E, John Hattie. He's actually a Kiwi, although a year and a bit ago, actually right about 2 weeks before I showed up at his former university, at the University of Auckland, he moved over to somewhere in Australia, I think it's Monash is where he went, because I was looking really forward to, I was on sabbatical, I was looking forward to meeting him, and I get there and find out that, while it was all hush-hush, 2 weeks earlier he had went across the Tasman. The book is called Visible Learning. It's a synthesis of over 800 meta-analysis related to student achievement. Essentially, if you're not familiar with the meta-analysis, and since there weren't many statisticians in the room, I'm going to assume that you're not. Essentially, if you take a look at all those studies that we were talking about, where you compare one group and another group, what you end up with is you end up with an effect size, whether or not they actually have, did one group fare better than the other group, and how much better did they fare. That's fine with an individual study. What a meta-analysis does is it takes a bunch of those studies together and combines the results to essentially end up with this super effect size. That says, if we take all of these like studies, so if we take all these studies that look at, how online learners at the secondary level do compared to face-to-face learners at the secondary level, and combine them all together, these are the results we come up with. what John has done is he's taken 800 of these studies that have combined already a bunch of studies together and combined them all together and looked at all of the individual variables that they've studied. And I think there's 132 variables that he's come up with that people have examined in terms of their impact upon student learning. And he goes through and actually ranks them. And he ranks them using this little speedometer thing that he's got here. Essentially, what his research has shown is that, well, obviously, if your meta-analysis comes up with a negative number, you've made the kids dumber by whatever you were trying to do. Because, you know, your treatment group performed worse than your control group. The average student will increase 0.15 effect size by getting a year older and a year wiser. So if you have a kid that starts off in grade 1, by the time he's in grade 2, the difference in his performance should be a 0.15 effect size just from that developmental experience. And that doesn't stop. So we're talking college students as well. They should improve from year to year just by getting a year older and a year wiser. We should improve year by year by getting a year older and a year wiser. An average teacher will have a 0.25 effect size. Not a good teacher, an average teacher. So essentially what it means is that if you've got a kid that's sitting in a classroom of an average student, of an average teacher for a year, they should increase 0.4 effect size. So John argues that essentially, in order to consider some of these things that we talk about in education, whether or not we should adopt some of these innovations, technological or otherwise, that they should have at least a 0.4 effect size. John is actually a little bit lenient in this. People who study effect sizes and who do meta-analysis, some of them have argued that it should be as high as 0.8. Others have said 0.6. 0.6 to 0.4 tends to be about the average for the community that do this kind of work. Gene Glass, who's one of the, at least in the education front, one of the pioneers of using meta-analysis, he actually argues for 0.8. So John is arguing about half of that. Now, if you look at the 3 studies that have been done into online learning, it's interesting to see how they perform. I mentioned a couple of them when we were going through. Kathy's initial meta-analysis back in 2001, essentially 0.15, which is about the average effect that you'd get by getting a year older and a year wiser. Right? If you look at the one she did 3 years later, it's actually negative. So the online students, by virtue of being in the online environment, got dumber than if they had been in the classroom environment. The U.S. Department of Education one, the one that Barb Means and the folks at SRI International did back in 2009, theirs was actually a very stringent one because US DOE likes to do apply the med school rules of research to education and the quasi-experimental design model and all those other things that add up to quality, which really don't, but that's another conversation for another day. They actually included 46 studies into their meta-analysis, only 5 of which focused upon the K-12 environment. When you looked at their overall results found, again, about the average effect of an average teacher, and then in the blended environment, which is when you've got online and face-to-face happening at the same time, it was approaching that 0.4 range, but still having them in the classroom of an average teacher would have done better. It's interesting to note that in the blended one, which is all the rage now in K-12, none of those studies actually included any of the K-12 studies. So the studies that are being reported here are all higher ed ones. Some of the things that are interesting to note, when you look at some of the reasons why they say we should use online learning, these are some of the things that they come up with that were listed in John's analysis. This notion of program instruction, individualized instruction, or student-controlled learning. Customization is the word that they use for all that. None of them are reaching the average effect of a classroom teacher, or the effect of an average classroom teacher. The student-controlled learning actually does very poorly. The only one that really does either very good is that second and third chance programs, but let's face it, there's nothing magic about the online environment for providing a second chance program. The traditional summer school we used to offer provided a second chance program. All these other ones, decreasing class size, removing disruptive behavior, charter schools, being able to learn at home, having a highly qualified teacher. It's another one of the big things. Having access to a highly qualified teacher. You see what access to a highly qualified teacher gets you? Not that much of an improvement. So a good teacher is a good teacher. They don't have to be a good math teacher. A good teacher is a good teacher. Oops. You know, so when you ask, you know, are the students really learning in the online environment? I think, you know, the question should actually be, you know, does online learning equal high quality learning? And as you can see, with those two questions back to back, in all honesty, it tends not to. You know, so when you look at the dominant narrative, you know, and what we've got, we can say a couple of things based on the research. First of all, that students today aren't that digitally savvy. They are narcissistic, but not digitally savvy. The supplemental students, those students that are in a brick and mortar environment, but taking a class or two to supplement their curriculum. Think of the kid up in the UP that can't get AP Chemistry, takes AP Chemistry online. They tend to do very well. You know, the kid that's learning Mandarin, regardless of where they're located in the state, that kid is going to do really well online. But let's face it, that kid's going to do really well pretty much whatever we give him. Full-time online learning works for very few students. Essentially, it works for the same kind of students that the supplemental works for. Those high-ability students. That's the 20 to 30% that actually pass. The rest of them, not so much. You know, and so you have to ask yourself, you know, being the cynic that I am, you know, what's this really all about? And I think, you know, those of us that are familiar with the field know what this is all about. Particularly those of us Canadians that can look south of the border at other public sectors that the Americans have decided to privatize throughout the course of history. And let's face it, you know, this is all about, you know, bowing down to the almighty dollar. This is essentially the privatization of public education for corporate profits. And it shouldn't surprise you that the largest online charter company in the United States is a publicly traded company. A publicly traded company that is currently under investigation in Florida and has a lawsuit pending against it by shareholders. The investigation in Florida is about whether or not they were assigning students to highly qualified teachers that they weren't actually teaching. The shareholder court case is actually about whether or not K-12 in their shareholder presentations have actually been overinflating student performance within their environment as a way of trying to sell more stocks. Should also note that it was only, I guess, 4 years ago. This is the same company that got caught in Arizona and Colorado outsourcing all of their grading to a company in India. So,
What's the name of the company?
In India that did that? Oh, this company, K-12 Inc. Yeah, it's the one, in case you're wondering, that runs the Michigan Virtual Academy. So if you look at any state and see state name Virtual Academy, that's the K-12 program. So the one here is Michigan Virtual Academy. It's based in Grand Rapids. I've got a whole whack of other stuff that I could do, but I notice I'm running up against time and wondering if folks have questions or not, because
Questions, comments?
Yeah, I have a question. I mean, it's very interesting to me about. I agree with you the part about the money thing, but it does sort of beg the question: then, what do we do with the technology? You know, in a way, what you really seem to be saying is, I mean, I was just telling the lady here before your discussion began. I mean, I got my iPad, I can watch television, I can read a book, I can do all these things, and I think I see these kids. They're doing all this stuff too, and I'm thinking, well, why aren't we using this in the classroom? On the other hand, you're saying kids aren't that digital savvy, it's only a few group of kids that are. So what does that mean? What do we do with the technology then? Is this just if it's not just a supplement, then what do you suggest we do with it then?
Well, I think you've hit on a couple of key points there. Yeah. What do we do with it is the big question, because you can see them doing the cursory type things you're doing, checking their email, watching YouTube and texting and all that kind of stuff. The question then becomes, well, just because they know how to use it, do they know how to use it for a purpose? Like, do they know how to use it in terms of how to learn, how to find something? And these are the things that they don't know. But the thing is, they could be taught. And in all honesty, I mean, while I would never say that technology in and of itself is a motivating factor, and if in all honesty the only way you can motivate a student is to put them in front of a flickering screen, you shouldn't be in the classroom in the first place. But it can enhance motivation, particularly once you don't have that individual interaction with them. So once they leave the classroom, once they leave your office, this can enhance motivation. The key for us, I think, is the first thing we've got to do is actually teach them how to use these tools for the purposes that we're looking at. You know, if this was actually one of the slides I had in my Texas presentation on Monday. But when we look at the research, there are a couple of key things that we know. One of which is that local support to the student is critical in the online environment. In the full-time environment, it's under the role of this learning coach is what they call it, but in all honesty, that's the parent. So if you've got a supportive parent, that's great. In the brick and mortar environment, when you've got the supplemental students, it tends to be right now, we stick the football coach in there because we don't want them teaching anything else, so it's easy enough to stick them at the desk in the front of the room while the kids are around at their computers. If you've got somebody in there other than the football coach that we don't want teaching anything else, that's going to actually go around and work with them on their soft learning skills, things like their independent learning skills, time management, self-directedness, just how to find things, effective search strategies, how to actually use the LMS to find things out. I'm willing to bet that, do you use Blackboard in your classes at all?
I've had Blackboard in classes.
I was going to say, I'm willing to bet that maybe 5% of the students that have used your Blackboard actually know to be able to go in and check to see how much of the course they've actually looked at. I assume if you've done the OTL's Blackboard thing, they'll show you how to go into the statistics and see last time the student logged in, how many discussion posts they've read, how many they've made, how many pages, and you can set it up so that you can actually track every single time a student clicks on a page. Students can access all that information, but they don't. Not only do they not access it, I'm willing to bet that 95% of them don't even know that it's there, and even if they knew it was there, they wouldn't know how to find it. One of the first things I think we should teach every single freshman when they walk in the door here is actually how to search using Boolean logic. This notion of just putting quotation marks around two words that you want to find together is a foreign concept to them. And it's not that difficult to teach them, but no one really understands that. If you want to search for, like if I was looking for online learning but not anything about K-12, I put online learning quotation marks and I put minus and then K-12 right behind it with no space. That means it's going to exclude everything that has the word K-12 in it, but it's going to find everything that has online learning together. Simple Boolean logic. I was taught it back in the, I hate to say this, but I graduated in '93. I was taught it when I was in high school. For some reason, we don't teach it now. And we don't teach it here when they get to the university environment. So a lot of these little things, I think that we can teach them how to use the tools, then it allows us to use them in more effective ways. If we just start incorporating the tools without doing that first step, I think we're just going to, achieve the same results that we're seeing in the K-12 environment.
Can you talk a little bit more about the managed growth? My friend and I are both in the middle of a school board race. I think you haven't actually talked about this maybe in Ferndale, where you just sort of crammed as many people as possible into the biggest online learning program possible. None of this sort of idea of managed growth, of finding the program that's right for the students, installed very transparently in a cash housing situation. And I wondered if you would talk about that managed growth a little bit, and if you have any examples of perhaps places locally where it's working. I have a friend in Southfield who's doing it very incrementally, and it sounds like he's having reasonably good results within, but on a very individual.
And that's where you're going to find it on an individual way, or in some cases on a statewide way. Wisconsin, when they first introduced cyber charters back in the mid-2000s, partly because the Wisconsin Education Association actually took them to court. But it was over a different issue. They took them to court because in Wisconsin the law said that teachers had to be certified by the state. You essentially had to have a teaching certificate. The full-time online learning model is based on the idea that the learning coach provides the primary instructional role. The learning coach in most cases is a parent or guardian, most of whom don't have a teaching certificate. So the WEA took the state to court, won both cases, which caused this big kerfuffle that had rallies like we had over the union busting, except for it was the neoliberals that were doing the rallying this time, as opposed to the progressives. But in the law that they changed, when they initially made the law, they capped it statewide as to the total number of online students. And then when they revised the law, I think it was Senator Doyle was the eventual piece of legislation that made it through, because at one point there were 7 competing pieces of legislation in the 2 houses, or in the House and the Senate. They, again, at the state level, it essentially said that the online programs could have X number of students and then could grow by X number of more each year. Very much like Michigan did when they introduced their initial cyber charter legislation. They started off with essentially saying the schools had to be limited to 400. The other thing that Michigan did that I thought was actually quite good, and this is another slide I used yesterday, was they tied growth to actual specific populations of students. So in the case of Michigan, in year 2 they were allowed to add 1,000 students. They could add student 401 to their regular program, but in order to add student 402, it had to come from the state's dropped-out roll. Now, there were problems with that because schools don't actually report when a student drops out. They usually wait until it hits them at full-time graduation time. So you've had students that haven't been counted for 2 and 3 years that, you know, are still considered in the system. So they couldn't enroll in the program. So that was, I mean, so there were some actual regulations that needed to be worked out. But the actual legislation I thought was sound. You know, if this is designed to be a second chance for students that can't make it in the face-to-face